What would you do if your child was put on trial just because of the color of their skin? A young black teen stands alone in the courtroom. No lawyer by his side, only the cold contempt of the judge and an entire system ready to crush him. But then he speaks, just one sentence, and the entire courtroom falls silent, frozen. From that moment on, the boy they tried to condemn starts turning the entire trial upside down. If you've ever questioned justice, even for a second, this is the story you cannot ignore. Don't forget to subscribe and leave your thoughts below, because what happens next might just make you rethink the entire system. Elijah Hart, 19 years old, stood accused of grand theft auto and assaulting an officer. But when he walked into Central Hill courtroom, something shifted. It wasn't the weight of the charges that quieted the room. It was the way he carried himself. He didn't look like any defendant they'd seen before. No slumped shoulders, no trembling hands. He stood tall, hands in his pockets, eyes locked on Judge Tobias Mercer, like he wasn't the one on trial, but the room itself was. From the bench, Judge Mercer leaned back, tapping his fingers on the polished wood. A smirk tugged at one corner of his mouth, equal parts dismissive and disinterested. "Let's move it along. I've got a tea time at 2, he muttered, to no one in particular. Just a reminder that this was a trial with a predetermined ending. Prosecutor Silas Bennett adjusted his tie and stood, delivering the charges like a script he'd memorized long ago. Caught at the scene. Fingerprints confirmed. Pursuit followed. This case is as straightforward as it gets. A few soft chuckles echoed from the back rows. Everyone thought the same thing. Another black teen, another conviction. Then they'd all go home. But then Elijah stepped forward, slowly, deliberately. His voice rang out, smooth but unshakable steel. "I'll represent myself." The courtroom stilled so completely you could hear the flip of a page. And then he raised his hand and pointed at the prosecution. "I reject Officer Declan Cross's testimony because he was never at the scene." A woman seated in the rear row brought a hand to her mouth. It was Amelia Hawthorne, Elijah's mother. And in that moment she knew her son had just ignited the battle she had always feared and quietly prayed for. Beneath the polished bench, Judge Tobias Mercer leaned back in his chair, the courtroom lights casting sharp reflections across his glasses, concealing eyes that barely bothered to glance down at the defendant. One hand tapped lazily on the gleaming wood, the other flipped through Elijah's case file as if it were just another stack of paperwork to sign before the end of his shift. "Let's keep this moving. I've got a tea time at 2, he murmured, not loud but loud enough for the front row to hear, and chuckled quietly. The atmosphere in Central Hill courtroom felt less like a pursuit of justice and more like a dress rehearsal for a verdict everyone already expected. In that moment, a quiet tension swept the room. Amelia Hawthorne, Elijah's mother, sat curled in the back row, clutching her purse strap tightly, trying to steady her breathing as she watched the judge openly display his bias. She had once been a legal aide, once believed in this system, but today all she saw was her son, boxed in by assumptions and bias before a word had even been spoken. Just another black case, another foregone conviction. No one said it aloud, but the thought hung heavy in the room. From the witness stand, Prosecutor Silas Bennett rose with confidence, tie perfectly tightened, his face a portrait of certainty. The vehicle was stolen. The defendant was caught in the act. Fingerprints confirmed. A pursuit followed. This case is simple. What he didn't know was that very simplicity would soon become his undoing. And the undoing of the system he thought was untouchable, because in just a few moments, Elijah would step forward and flip the entire game on its head. Not with power, but with a truth no one in that courtroom saw coming. Silas Bennett rose from the prosecutor's table with the air of a man who had nothing left to prove. His voice rang out, clear, precise, deliberate, like it had been rehearsed in front of a mirror 100 times. The defendant, Elijah Hart, was apprehended at the scene, inside a missing Audi A6, reported stolen just hours earlier. His fingerprints were found on the steering wheel. We have sworn testimony from an officer on duty. We have pursuit footage recorded by city surveillance. He paused, letting his gaze sweep over the jury like a silent challenge. "What more do you need?" Elijah said nothing. No nod, no objection, not even a blink. From the back row, Amelia Hawthorne, Elijah's mother, leaned slightly forward. Her eyes began to glisten, but the tears held their place. Because she'd seen this before, too many times to count. Cases where the accusations had been drafted long before the truth was ever invited into the room. A black boy, a missing car, an officer's word, and suddenly that was enough. Bennett pressed on, not missing a beat. "And if the defense is going to suggest this was a misunderstanding, then let me ask you this. Since when does an innocent person run from the police?" The question hung in the air, sharp, rhetorical, meant not for an answer, but as a blade. And it cut deep. But right then, Elijah finally raised his head. He didn't deny. He didn't argue. He just stared directly at Silas Bennett, calm and steady, like he was simply waiting for his turn. And in that look, there was something undeniable. He knew something no one else in that courtroom did. Elijah didn't respond right away. He simply sat there, still as stone, as if calculating every breath like a move in a life-or-death chess match. Prosecutor Silas Bennett had just finished laying out the case. His words still echoed in the courtroom, clinging to the air. But Elijah refused to be swept into the tide. He observed, he listened. He absorbed every glance, every nod weighed down by bias. He'd heard of this moment 100 times before, through the stories of his mother, Amelia Hawthorne, a woman who had dedicated her entire legal career to trying to fix a system that refused to admit it was broken. At the defense table, Attorney Juliet Carter's hand trembled slightly as she rose. She knew the case file was paper thin, knew that her role was little more than a formality to ensure legal representation for the accused. But just as she opened her mouth to speak, Elijah gently touched her arm. That single touch, soft but firm, said everything. He wanted to fight this battle on his own. She hesitated, then nodded and slowly sat back down. Elijah rose. No cough, no whisper. The room seemed to freeze in time. Even Judge Tobias Mercer leaned forward, his fingers falling still, as if to make sure he'd heard what he thought he had. Elijah's voice rang out, calm, measured, not pleading, not asking, just claiming what was his. "Your Honor, I will represent myself." And in that instant, the courtroom forgot how to breathe, because for the first time all day, from a boy they'd already written off as guilty, came a voice that stopped the entire system in its tracks. The air inside Central Hill courtroom thickened the moment Elijah Hart declared he would represent himself. Everyone seemed to brace for a nervous stammer, a clumsy plea, the kind of misstep they expected from a teenager in over his head. But Elijah didn't tremble. He didn't retreat. He didn't need prep time. He needed only 1 second to turn the entire trial on its head. He turned to face Prosecutor Silas Bennett, meeting his gaze without flinching. "Your Honor," Elijah began, not loud, but just loud enough to quiet every breath in the room. "Before I begin my defense, I move to dismiss the testimony of Officer Declan Cross." A ripple of surprise flickered across the room. Judge Mercer narrowed his eyes ever so slightly. Elijah took a long, steady breath. The kind of breath you take when you know what you say next might shape the rest of your life. Because Officer Cross was not present at the scene when the incident occurred. The stir that followed wasn't loud, but it cut through the courtroom like wind through an open field. Bennett froze mid-page, his lips pressed into a tight line, and for the first time that morning, Judge Mercer stopped tapping his fingers. From the gallery, Amelia Hawthorne clasped her hands tightly. It wasn't just what Elijah said, it was how. Not like a 19-year-old, but like someone who had studied every crack in the law and knew exactly where to strike. Elijah continued, voice firm. "Even if permitted, I will present evidence that Officer Cross was nowhere near East Bay Center at the time of the alleged incident. And if that testimony is false, then the entire foundation of this prosecution begins to fall apart." Each word sliced through the silence with surgical precision. For the first time, the system blinked. The air inside Central Hill courtroom felt vacuumed of sound, like the very walls were holding their breath. Elijah Hart stood alone, face to face with justice. Not the textbook version wrapped in balance and fairness, but the warped, weary power molded from bias and convenience. He didn't flinch, didn't blink. "Your Honor," Elijah said, his voice steady, deliberate, "I request the court verify the GPS records of Officer Declan Cross on the night of the incident." A beat, then calm as ever, he continued. "If he was truly present at the scene as stated in his report, the GPS will confirm it." He looked up, eyes sharp as steel. "But if he wasn't, then that testimony must be dismissed, along with every argument built around it." Judge Mercer furrowed his brow, not in anger but because doubt had just crept into a place where power was used to certainty. Prosecutor Bennett faltered. His rhythm cracked. "All due respect, Your Honor, the defendant can't simply dismiss an officer's statement." But the room wasn't looking at Bennett. They were watching Elijah, not because he shouted, but because he didn't need to. The truth had a voice of its own. In the last row, Amelia Hawthorne gripped the edge of her seat. She had seen power abused in courtrooms before, but never imagined her own son would be the one forced to prove that the man pointing the finger had lied. A 19-year-old, facing a system and daring to name the truth the grown-ups kept dodging. Elijah let his request for the GPS records hang in the air, then shifted gears with sharp precision. "And since we're speaking of evidence," he said, "I have a question for the prosecution." He turned his head toward Silas Bennett, this time not just with cold focus, but with the precision of someone striking directly at the foundation of the legal argument being used against him. Elijah asked, "Which forensic expert processed the fingerprint sample on the steering wheel?" Silence swept through the courtroom once more. Judge Mercer raised an eyebrow, as if hearing for the first time a detail that should have never been overlooked. Silas Bennett cleared his throat. "I don't have the expert present today, but the results were confirmed by the forensics lab." Elijah didn't interrupt. He simply waited, then turned to face the jury. "No expert is present. No one can be cross-examined. No one here to answer questions about the process, the margin of error, or the chain of custody. And yet they want to use that evidence to convict me. No shouting, no outrage, just truth, spoken by someone the system never expected to ask the right question." In the back of the room, Amelia Hawthorne tilted her head and closed her eyes, not in despair, but in memory of all the trials she once stood in, saying the same things, ignored by men who looked just like Silas. But this time, it was her son who said it, in a courtroom, on the record. And this time, no one dared interrupt. Elijah took one step closer to the witness stand, steady, unhurried. The whispers were gone now. All that remained was the faint sound of wind brushing against the glass panes behind the courtroom. He opened the folder he'd brought with him and gently pulled out a single printed page. Without looking at anyone, Elijah began to read, his voice clear, firm, deliberate. Each word dropped like weight on the scale, as if he knew they weren't just meant to save himself, but maybe someone else down the line. "I left the car running when I ran into the Brookvale Gas and Go. A kid, looked no older than 15, jumped in and drove off. But it wasn't the kid they arrested. The one I saw was white. Franklin Rhodes, registered owner of the stolen Audi A6. The silence that followed didn't sound like shock. It sounded like something deeper. Disbelief turned into dread. Judge Mercer leaned back slightly, eyes shifting from the document to Prosecutor Bennett, as if waiting for an explanation he already knew wouldn't come. Bennett's face flushed red, his fists clenched at his sides, but there was nothing to say. Elijah held up the copy of the statement, then turned to face the jury. This testimony was part of the original report, and for some reason, it was removed before it reached you. From the back of the courtroom, Amelia Hawthorne broke into tears for the first time that morning. Not out of weakness, but because she knew this strike was the kind no system could quietly erase. Elijah never had to raise his voice. He only had to remind them, the truth, sometimes, is the first thing they leave out of the file. Elijah didn't rush to strike again after revealing the forgotten statement from the car's owner. He didn't gloat, didn't press. He simply stood still for a few seconds, then looked directly at each member of the jury, not to accuse them, but to reach them. I didn't steal that car. I just touched it. He drew a deep breath, then began to speak, slowly as if pulling them gently into a memory that wasn't just his, but could have been anyone's. That day, I was walking past the Audi A6 with two friends. It was parked outside Silver Lane Market, unlocked. I was curious. I pulled the handle. The door opened. I put my hand on the steering wheel, then closed the door and walked away. No one interrupted. No raised eyebrows. Just quiet. Elijah pressed his lips together, then continued. It's like trying on a jacket at the mall. You don't take it. You don't walk out the door. You just touch it and leave. In the gallery, a man nodded slightly, not even realizing he had. A woman clenched her hands, perhaps thinking of her own child, and how easily he too could have looked enough like a suspect to be arrested. Elijah turned back, stood tall. No defense, no offense. I wasn't arrested because of evidence. I was arrested because I looked like someone the system is used to blaming. The entire courtroom stilled, not because he shouted, but because he was right. So right that no one had anything left to say. Elijah didn't apologize for touching the Audi that day. He didn't plead. He didn't justify. He stood tall in the center of Central Hill courtroom, the late morning light slanting through the window, casting a long line across the floor beneath his feet, as if even the building itself was holding its breath. I opened that car door at the Brookvale Gas and Go. It wasn't locked. I placed my hand on the steering wheel, and I walked away. I didn't drive it. I didn't take anything. And I honestly didn't think I was doing something wrong. A hush pushed through the gallery, soft, almost like wind slipping between the pews. No one moved. No one dared even clear their throat. And right then, something shifted at the judge's bench. Tobias Mercer, who had been leaning back with the ease of a man listening to a speech he didn't plan to remember, slowly straightened in his chair. He removed his glasses, placed them deliberately on the bench, rubbed his hands together like he was trying to wipe off something that had quietly stained him. For the first time that morning, his eyes landed on Elijah, not with the gaze of a man sitting above a minor case, but with the gaze of a human being, finally seeing another human being. In the back row, Amelia Hawthorne turned her face away, not to hide tears, but to shield the fragile hope rising in her chest. Hope that maybe, just this once, someone inside the system might finally open their eyes. Elijah didn't need to win the argument. He just needed them to listen, and he had. Elijah didn't stop after dismantling the prosecution's case. Piece by piece, he moved forward, quietly but with a force that nothing in that room could hold back. From the slim folder in his hands, he pulled out another document. The paper was faded, but the signature at the bottom was unmistakable. Franklin Rhodes. This is the original statement from Mr. Franklin Rhodes, the owner of the vehicle. He clearly states that the person who drove off with his Audi was a white teenager, not me. Elijah looked up and locked eyes with Judge Mercer as he read that line aloud, an unspoken question in his gaze. Can you still ignore this? The courtroom went still again, but this time, the silence no longer belonged to power. It belonged to the truth. The kind of truth that can't be redacted, can't be misplaced, can't be buried under procedural dust. Judge Mercer leaned on his elbows, tapping once, absent-mindedly, then exhaled, a long, quiet breath from a man who had finally run out of reasons to pretend. This case is dismissed. The words didn't need a gavel, just a sentence, strong enough to break apart something that never should have been built in the first place. Elijah didn't smile in victory. He simply gave a slight nod, an acknowledgement that justice, though delayed, is still possible, if someone is brave enough to challenge fear. In the back row, Amelia Hawthorne finally let go of the purse she'd clutched all morning. Her shoulders trembled, but she didn't cry, because she knew. Today, her son didn't just win a trial. He shook a system that had long believed it was untouchable. As Franklin Rhodes' testimony rang through the courtroom, clear and unwavering, A quiet fracture split open across the surface of a trial once believed to be impenetrable. Elijah stood there. No added words, no begging, no excuses. He let the truth speak for itself, in a room far too accustomed to the sound of gavels in place of conscience. Judge Tobias Mercer exhaled once more. But this time, the fatigue was gone. What lingered now was the weight of realization. The entire case, from fingerprints and officer statements to the convenient absence of witnesses, was a chain of fragile links, now breaking one by one. Silas Bennett, once the picture of prosecution pride, stared down into his folder, his fingers curling around the edge of a page like it might keep him from unraveling. He said nothing, because there was nothing left to say. A juror shook their head quietly to themselves, not in protest, but in shame, for having once trusted how easy the system made belief feel. And then, Central Hill courtroom fell into a silence unlike any before. Not the silence of restraint, not the silence of authority, but the silence of awakening. Amelia Hawthorne let the handkerchief slip from her fingers. She didn't reach to pick it up. Her eyes, after years in courtrooms just like this one, glistened not only with pain, but with something rarer, a fragile, flickering hope that even this system, slow, stubborn, scarred, could be moved. Elijah looked around, not triumphant, not proud, just still, like someone who had just proven, beyond all doubt, that truth doesn't always need to shout. Sometimes it only needs one person brave enough to stand up and not step back. When Judge Mercer declared the case dismissed, Elijah didn't step down right away. He stood still, like there was one final truth that still needed to be spoken. Not to clear his name, but to shine a light on what the system still refused to see. I was arrested while walking. Not next to the Audi, not behind the wheel. I was 6 blocks away, with 2 friends and a bag of groceries we just bought from Glennet Corner Market. He paused, his eyes swept across the courtroom. Not with anger, but with a quiet weight that made it hard to look back at him. I was stopped, handcuffed, and charged because I was the closest thing they saw. A breath. Then, because I looked like someone who could have done it. No one spoke. No one dared. At the back of the room, a young police officer leaned forward, gaze lowered, as if Elijah had just said aloud a fear he'd never dared voice even to himself. And Amelia Hawthorne placed a hand over her chest, not to stop her heart from breaking, but to steady herself as her son spoke a truth she had once buried deep just to keep going. They didn't arrest me because of evidence. A final pause. They arrested me because of where I was and because of the color of my skin. Those words didn't just echo inside the courtroom. They lodged in minds, settled in chests, etched themselves into memory, because everyone there knew, if today it was Elijah, then tomorrow it could be anyone without someone strong enough to speak. Elijah looked each person in the courtroom straight in the eye and began to speak, not with anger, but with a quiet, unshakable force. His voice was slow, deliberate, and razor sharp. Your Honor, I wasn't arrested because of any specific criminal act. I was arrested because I looked close enough to the image this system has already built in its mind. He paused just long enough for the weight of that truth to settle. Just long enough for every soul in that room to feel the pain buried beneath the gaze of prejudice. There is no clear evidence that I drove that car, or that I stole anything. The officers and prosecutors built their entire case on what they thought they saw, on an assumption, a stereotype, a bias they never questioned. His voice didn't waver. I am not a criminal. I'm just a teenager who was walking home with some dinner, with 2 friends. And the only reason I became a suspect was because of how I look. Tension thickened in the courtroom. Movement stilled, breaths held, and Elijah went on, unwavering. Every time I look in the mirror, I don't see a crime scene. I see a human being, with dreams, with hope, and with a desire to be treated fairly. But I can't shake the feeling that this system already had a mold waiting, one made to punish people like me. He took a breath. The next words landed with the weight of truth that no one could dodge. And that isn't just injustice. It's a devastating declaration about what a life is worth in this society. The courtroom didn't just fall silent. It emptied of sound. Even the air seemed to pause, because every person there, in that moment, felt the sting of what it means to be judged not by your actions, but by the skin you live in. Judge Tobias Mercer had walked into the courtroom thinking this would be just another case, another routine morning before his tea time at Highland Links. But now, standing before him wasn't a defendant. It was a human being, a young man standing tall, eyes locked with his own, challenging not just the verdict, but the indifference Mercer had long used as armor in this profession. He leaned back, a familiar reflex, but this time he stopped midway, then slowly sat up straight. He set down his gavel, removed his glasses, wiped them with the hem of his robe, not to clear dust, but as if trying to see more clearly. Not the case file, not the police reports, not the courtroom formalities, but Elijah. For the first time, he truly looked at the boy, and the way he looked wasn't judicial. It was human. In that moment, something subtle but seismic shifted. Mercer was no longer in control of the courtroom by the weight of his authority. Elijah now held it by the sheer force of truth. No one in the room may have noticed, but Amelia Hawthorne did. The mother who had lived too long with quiet fear saw it, the faint tremor in Mercer's gaze, and she knew. Today, it wasn't just her son on trial. The whole system was being pulled into the light. And in that exact moment, where history, power, and truth converged, a man who once thought himself untouched by it all began to truly listen. When Judge Mercer's final words rang out, "This case is dismissed," the air in the courtroom didn't explode. It shifted, like wind changing direction, silent but undeniable. No one screamed, but something broke open. Stunned eyes, half-parted lips that forgot to close. Reporters' pens sprang to life, scratching across notepads like they were chasing a legal earthquake unfolding in real time. Elijah didn't move, not from shock, not from pride, but because he understood exactly what had just happened. He had done what thousands before him hadn't been allowed to do. Not because they didn't try, but because they weren't given the chance. A woman in the back row gripped her son's hand tighter. An older juror wiped his glasses for the third time. But this time, it was to hide the tear that had slipped through before he could stop it. In that moment, Elijah was no longer a defendant. He was a living testament to something rare in the history of that room, a system that, if only for a flicker in time, had truly listened. In that moment, captured in notes, on camera, and echoed across millions of screens in the days that followed, was not an ending. It was the beginning of a new question the whole society now had to confront. If it hadn't been Elijah, if he didn't know the law, if his mother hadn't been a former attorney, would the outcome have been the same? And if the answer is no, then what we're calling justice isn't justice at all. It's privilege, dressed in the costume of fairness. As the final gavel struck, and the courtroom swelled with the chaotic sounds of disbelief and furious note-taking, Elijah simply stood there, silent, no smile, no raised fist, no triumphant stride of someone who had just overturned a courtroom. Because he never came to win anything. He came to be heard. And now, he had been, not with rage, not with shouting, but with truth and patience deep and unshakable like bedrock. As the flurry of cameras flashed and questions flew, Elijah quietly put on his cap, pulled it low over his brow, and walked out as if he had never belonged under the glare of a spotlight. Because he didn't need it. What he needed, what he fought for, was a different story for those who would come after him. On the stone steps of Cedar Row Plaza, his mother, Amelia, was already waiting. She didn't rush into his arms. She just looked at him, then gently reached up to touch his cheek as if to say, "I always knew." Elijah turned when a voice called from behind him, "You ought to consider law school." Judge Mercer, no longer sarcastic but sincere. Elijah nodded. "I don't need to consider it, sir. I started a long time ago." Final narration. Closing voiceover. Elijah didn't come to prove he was brilliant. He came to remind us, justice should never be something you have to deserve. It's something everyone should be given. From the very first breath of the fight. Outside the courthouse gates, Cedar Row stretched beneath the glow of a fading sun. The crowd hadn't thinned, half drawn by curiosity, the other half clinging to something that looked like hope. But only one person stepped through the barricades without asking. Amelia Hawthorne, Elijah's mother. She didn't care who was watching, didn't flinch at the cameras. She only knew one thing. She had her son back, not just in the eyes of the law, but in the light of the truth. Elijah didn't have time to speak. She wrapped her arms around him, tight, unyielding, as if letting go for even a second might mean losing him all over again. It wasn't the embrace of victory. It was the embrace of a mother who had once stood helpless against prejudice, and now wept not out of joy, but release. "You don't have to hold it in anymore," she whispered. "I saw you, and now the world does too." Elijah gave a small nod. He didn't say "I'm okay" because he never really had been. But now, he was free. Not because he was let go, but because he was finally seen. And in that fleeting moment, between the sirens, the pounding of footsteps on courthouse stone, and the swarm of watching eyes, there were only two people who stood still. A mother, a son, and a truth, finally given the space to bloom. As Elijah turned to leave, Judge Mercer's voice rose. For the first time since the trial began, stripped of sarcasm, stripped of ego. "You should consider law school." The room stilled. No one expected him to say that. But Elijah didn't turn right away. He paused, then looked over his shoulder and smiled, softly, sincerely, with a knowing edge. "I don't need to consider it. I've already started." The silence shattered into a wave of breathless awe. But Elijah didn't bask in it. He simply kept walking, past the rows of benches, past the weight of history that had tried to press him down, leaving behind not a spotlight, but a statement. He hadn't come to be famous. He hadn't come to prove a point. He came to remind them that what's right can still be heard, even in the heart of what's wrong. The cameras panned slowly. His mother, Amelia, gripped his hand, not as someone clinging to survival, but as someone holding a future finally reclaimed. But to Elijah, this wasn't a second chance. It was the path, the one he was always meant to walk. Final narration, closing voiceover. Justice doesn't arrive on its own. It needs people to step toward it. One small step at a time, one brave voice at a time, one stand taken where silence used to be. Elijah made a courtroom listen, not because he shouted, but because he stood firm. And maybe the next one to stand will be you. If this story made you pause, even for a moment, leave your thoughts below. And if you believe change begins with the smallest acts, hit subscribe and join us for the next journey toward justice.